Okay, so let's do it. So, all right, guys. So today we're going to talk about language, right? So, what is language, and can we have knowledge without language? Can we think without language? I think those are some good questions to start the conversation and explore a little bit what the topic is all about, what language is all about. Initial thoughts.
Yeah, could you have a language without having people or even biological organisms? Like, I guess there's like an abstract language, and then there's like that language applied to like a living being. So like we utter sounds, and that's how we understand our language. Or other animals might do different things to. So there's like sound waves. That's one way to like communicate a language. But I guess there's probably other ways to do it too, like Morse code is a language, I guess. So yeah,
gesture.
Any sense, I guess, you could kind of use to create a language.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think the most important thing about language is something they call, what do they call it? Displaced reference, right? And the ability to talk about something that isn't within demonstrable distance. You can't point to it, you can't, and that presupposes a level of intelligence to be able to have those thoughts first before you then express those thoughts, whether it's through sound or through gestures.
Yeah, sign language is a language, and that just involves sounds.
It is. Yeah.
I consider mathematics a form of language, and ancient human beings threw spears and rocks and stuff like that at animals, and if they missed, they picked up the spear and they threw it again. And so they developed an analog understanding of trajectory and force. And we now know that those things can be understood or expressed in a mathematical way, but we didn't know it at the time. So that was analog knowledge that we later developed a description for. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Here's an ironic definition of language: it's a device to hide thoughts.
Explain.
That's an interesting point, because now we feel like we have to be able to put things into words, because that's how we interact with other human beings through nonverbal stuff too. But if your principles that you hold dear are not expressed in a form of language, there's very little difference, it seems to me, between standing behind your principles and hiding behind them. It seems like we need to be able to express ourselves.
Yeah, but sometimes we use language like not to express ourselves, but for hiding ourselves.
I
So
suppose. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah,
Like,
go on.
No, I suppose you mean if you're blushing and you said, "No, I'm not embarrassed at all. I'm not self-conscious at all." So that's one way to use language to hide your feelings. No.
So I suppose the engineer in me is going to come out and say, I basically think language is a method for encoding information. Of course, that just begs the question about what is information, but that's how I tend to think of language is in encryption and encoding and compression. And I think of it in terms of
Sure.
data
Yeah,
and how you transmit data.
yeah,
Whether that language be spoken, written, physical gestures, or whatever. You're
Or
transmitting
or
data.
waves of light in a fiber optic cable.
Yep, exactly.
If you talk to your mother on the phone and
Yep.
say something, the words go in from changes in air pressure to electric signals to electromagnetic waves, and but the message is the same, at least in terms of the words. And in a very real way, they're the same when she repeats them to your father at the other end of the couch.
Yeah,
You know.
sure. I mean, that's how we see and hear each other right now is
Yeah.
through that various forms of information encoding. The fun thing about information encoding is there are usually two kinds. There are lossy and there are lossless. And most kinds are lossy, which means actually information is lost in
Right.
the encoding process and it is not restored on the other end. There are things that do lossless encoding for, but that's usually going from digital data to other forms of digital data when you need to do these analog to digital conversions like we're doing here now to
Yeah.
see and talk to each other. And there's data being lost. So, we might look a little bit fuzzy or we might lose some sound.
I would say
That
even
stuff.
outside of the physics of it all, language and conversation is always lossy, and I think.
I think you're correct, but it's the closest we come to sharing our minds with one
Exactly.
another.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah. It's
it's not perfect, but it's the best tool we have.
right, right. One of the things I think about once in a while is I think humans have two ways of either transmitting or absorbing information, is either as pattern, which is, sort of like a pattern to me is always grasping a pattern is always instant recognition. It's just you don't see it, and then you see it. And then the other, but we can't communicate that way. We always communicate in a serial fashion and through one idea after another, and then we try to build a pattern in our minds about the information, the narrative basically that we're receiving. And the problem is the pattern that somebody is trying to convey to you. When you reassemble it, it might not be exactly what the sender was thinking. And probably half the problems of humanity result from that miscommunication.
It's like we all have different ideas about what we are talking about.
Yeah.
Like when you may say one word, and I may have a different experience related to this word, and I may just interpret it in a different way, and just one word. But when there's the whole idea which we try to communicate, it's very hard to convey it in certain words that everybody can understand exactly what you want to say.
Yeah.
Since it's
Well,
and
it's-
go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say that it seems that like what you're pointing out, right, is language. The obvious intention behind language is to communicate something to other people. But how does that affect the way we think in the first place? I think that's a harder question.
Right.
I mean, both issues are interesting, right? The communication is interesting, certainly as well. But before we get to the part of the communication, like has language affected us in some way, right? Has it changed the way we thought about things in the first place that we're trying to communicate? That is, that's an interesting question.
I've heard Noam Chomsky say that language is just as much to help us think as it is to help us communicate with others. So it's like it helps us straighten out our own thoughts, not
Yeah.
just communicate them to other people. And it's really interesting. That's quite an expensive process. Like taking what you know and having to put it into words. That takes a lot of energy. That's part of why being a teacher is often difficult. It's like you have the idea in your head,
Mhm.
but you have to figure out how to phrase it or how to express it.
Or how to get it to occur in the student's head.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. And we only base it on this is how I think, and because we're the same species or maybe even the same culture, then probably you'll think of it the way I do when I send you these verbal cues, and you know, it works
And-
well
and-
enough. I
And
think.
nonverbal too, because
And nonverbal cues,
and-
yes.
Yeah,
Because-
there's an interesting thing from what Michael was talking about with what you might call intellectual economics. And that is how efficient is it for, yeah, I can't even talk. See, there we go now. To express your thoughts in different forms of communication. For example, the obvious one is, what's the difference between speaking and writing?
Right.
And they are two I think they actually use quite different portions of the brain
Yeah.
in order to do one versus the other. And the intellectual economics of the two, I think, are quite different too, in terms of, in a lot of ways, writing is a more efficient way of transferring information than speaking. But then there are other kinds of information that speaking is better at transferring than writing. And part of the trick is to be able to tell which is which when you're
Right.
going to do it.
It's like thinking slow and thinking fast. Basically, when you
Yeah.
write,
Yeah.
you're just more reflective and you try to arrange your language, your ideas in certain patterns. But when you speak, it's more intuitive. And I also watched some lectures by Noam Chomsky, and I guess it was even more like what Michael said. It's like he said something like the language is the tool for thinking. So basically, the function of language, according to Noam Chomsky, is to think, not to communicate. And communication is just the second, like, kind of side product of its evolution. And
Yeah.
it makes sense when you think about it like deeply. Most of the time, when you use language, you think. You don't communicate
No.
like all day long. But when you are like in this state of wakefulness, when
Right.
you're conscious, you are thinking all the time.
Go ahead. Sorry, Vladimir.
Yeah, and just few hours a day you spend on communication. That's like one of my ideas was when I started studying English. I tried to, and basically my studying it was also like me teaching some other people's language, even though I didn't know language well. I couldn't speak, but I came up with this idea to think in English all the time, and I basically tried to share my experience, saying that, you know, if you just start thinking, it's more productive than just speaking, since when you speak, it's only you need a partner, you need somebody whom you can talk to, and especially if you're just a beginner, it's a hard job to find somebody. And when you think, you may think all the time, and you may do it alone, and all you need is just the time. And so, and I was like basically like developing this idea of thinking all the time in a foreign language. And it makes a lot of sense when like you see how you would basically think for 10 hours a day, and language just grows. And
Right.
but sometimes it may cause problems since you learn to think. And as we said before, like you form some ideas and you form some different ways of conveying information, and then it may be difficult for you to communicate with people, since your way of communicating may become so unique that it will require more, it will harder to express an idea in a way that other people may understand you. Whereas when you only communicate with people, it seems that you are on the same level like all the time, and it's not so difficult. Yeah.
Well,
And-
oh, sorry, Raul, go
No,
ahead.
go ahead, Bruno.
No, I was just gonna ask Vladimir, but do you think that when you think, are you always using a language? Because that is not entirely clear to me that we are using indeed a language when we are.
Yeah, there are two ways, like verbal thinking and kind of imagery thinking. And for me,
Non-verbal mental ease.
yeah, but for me, like when I say thinking, I basically mean just like verbal thinking. So when you
Right.
may track what, like in my case, I just use often some recording devices like a type recorder or a video camera, and I just talk. I talk, or I just record my thoughts. So it's
Yeah.
it's most of the time it's verbal, and yeah, I guess it's harder, like to think verbally than non-verbally, and it's not natural, since in my opinion most people don't think when they just go, and they don't focus their attention on thinking. It's not thinking. When you may go for a walk, and you may do nothing, and you may think that you're thinking, but you're actually not thinking.
Mhm.
So you just you may remember something, you may just daydream, and there's difference between daydreaming and
Right.
Yeah, it seems
thinking.
it seems to me it's hard to determine if you're using a language or not, because I'm trying to think, like, do I use a language when I'm thinking? And I don't know about you guys, but I'm having some trouble here actually coming up with an answer.
I think it depends on what you're thinking about. If you're trying to think of, for example, trying to come up with a theoretical framework or a schematic framework in your head, and it's a complicated subject or problem that you're working on.
There's a lot of
And-
layers in the onion.
Right, and neuroscientists and psychologists have pretty much established that the human mind can really handle only 7 pieces of information at most, and count up to whatever. And so there are limits in our working memory, and one of the things we develop is a notion of clumping, of getting pieces of information that are related to each other, and thinking of that as a package. And so we handle, we have clumps of thoughts, and if you're thinking about, let's say, 4 or 5 different ideas that you're trying to meld, I think it's natural for you to attach a label to each one, whether it's just a number 1 or number 2 or number 3. But and so the notion of an internal language or mentalese, as David said, I think it is a very valid one. I do believe in the theory that there is an internal language.
But that internal language, is it the same that we use externally, say English, Russian, Portuguese, or Spanish, or French? Is it a language that we actually use?
I think if it's available to you, then you use it. But if it's not, then you coin a word, and then you introduce it to the larger environment, and then it might become that's how words are coined. I think somebody has an idea, needs a name for it, label for it, and says, this is what I call this. That's just my
And if other people understand it the first time you say it,
right.
it's a word.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
even
again,
if
you may always go back and see what you are thinking about. Whereas when you don't think, when you just daydream,
Right.
you may like go for a walk, and then at the end of the walk you don't remember what was going on in your mind.
Mhm.
You were thinking, but you can say what was that. Whereas when you really think, there are some steps, and you may always trace it back and find
Right.
how it began and
Well,
what was going on.
I think this is not a mature thought, but I think there might be some value in what you're describing, in cultivating the ability to think without words, because if we don't do that, we would never come up with anything new that we had to make a word for.
Mhm.
Yeah, sure, it's necessary. I don't deny it, but it's like when you want to relax, and there's kind of two types of thinking. One is when you like diffuse mode and focus mode. So in one case, you want to just focus your attention on something and came up with ideas, and then of course you need to do some, this brainstorm or unfocused thinking. It's also necessary to like do any creative process. I like this idea that thinking helps you to focus your attention on a particular subject. And in my case, I often use it like I don't even know what I'm going to think about, but I just choose a topic, and then I use language and try to keep my attention as long as possible on the subject. So it may be like the concept of language itself. And often my mind just wanders, and like when I try to focus it on one particular subject, it just wanders in many directions. And the whole idea of language, like verbal thinking, is to keep attention on this subject as long as possible and discover something new, discover something that I haven't understood before, or something that I didn't think about before. And you may do it for in my case, this difference between what Bruno said, like thinking for oneself or thinking and speaking. Like I tried, no, I'm practicing self-talk, and it's very unusual. Most of people don't do that, and they even think it's crazy. And for me, the most exciting ideas and thoughts which I had were discovered when I did long self-talks, like for hours, like 2 hours, 3 hours. And usually when you talk to yourself, again, at the beginning, it's kind of strange and silly, but then you go deeper and deeper, and you may just go, wow, it's like you're, in my opinion, you will never be able to reach anything like that when you communicate with people, since when you communicate with people, you're most of the time you're insincere. So it requires a really long and stable relationship for you to say really what you think, and often you just say whatever you has to say to keep you basically try to pretend that you're a different person than you're in your thoughts. And when you talk to yourself, when you develop this long conversation with yourselves, you just go even deeper, and you discover some shadow parts of your ego, and something that.
And I know I struggle with is this skin part of the onion I was peeling or not? Or maybe it's part of another onion. I don't know.
No, it's
Yeah. So sort of in a similar vein, do you guys think we need a complex language to have a complex thought, or in general to develop complex ideas? Do we need to have a complex language that we speak in order to get there, or that's not necessarily the case?
Well, I think it's possible to have a perfectly complex thought in purely visual form. In fact, I often think when I think, very frequently, I have little movies playing in my head that have both video and sound along with the words. How you express that to another person is, I think, the fascinating part there, because you can't put necessarily, how do you show the other person the pictures that are going around in your head while you're having a thought?
That reminds me of there was an artist, a painter, who did a painting that was widely admired, and he was at an exhibition, and somebody asked him, what does it mean? And he said, well, if I could put it into words, I wouldn't need to paint it.
Well, that's
No,
that's a pretty
it's-
good answer.
No, yeah, but I think I think it goes both ways. It's complex thoughts force us to develop complex language, but the ability to express yourself in a complex language also, it's a feedback mechanism. I believe it is, you know. I mean, maybe there's something you experienced and you're thinking, oh yeah, that thing I felt when so and so or this and that happened, and you might not have a word for it yet, but it's something that's totally new to you. And so yeah, you do need to come up with a word for that if you want to communicate it to other people, and then have a shorthand for it. But then on the other hand, if there's someone, that person who begins to understand that word as you explained it, then that's a new arrow in his or her armory of what to think about, how to think, and how to express himself or herself.
So it's kind of a loop in a way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's like most things, I think, that it's a feedback. It goes back and forth, you know.
Well, I think it's interesting because I personally like to try to avoid using big words whenever possible. That's my sort of pet peeve in life. I feel like a lot of times people will intentionally use fancy words for things
Yeah.
to sound smart. But the thing is,
Mark Twain said, never use a big word when a diminutive one will do.
diminutive. Yeah, exactly.
That's
But the thing is, sometimes you keep when you want to use simpler words, you end up having to say the same idea over and over again using like 5 or 6 words. So if you want to be efficient, at some point you got to cave in and say, hey, I got to make a word for that. I can't keep saying that same thing over and over. And what's really interesting is when this process happens so many times, and you end up getting something that's so far distant from the original language, because you just keep having this, condense these concepts. So yeah.
Yeah, it depends on the context. Most of the time, it depends whom you are talking to. So if you're in a kind of meetings related to certain activity, you may use big words and everybody understand these words, and you don't need to convey your message it makes a conversation simpler. Whereas if you like in a philosophy club and you use some medical terms, you need to explain any term, and it just takes a little more time. I mean,
It's kind of
it
interesting.
makes
It's
it
like-
more complex. Yeah.
I was going to say, it's interesting. It's almost like each business has its own language. Like if you go to a business meeting at one company, they're like, oh, if you take this and this column from this and this table, then it matches this and this. Like they all have their own lingo, because if they had to describe it in terms of basic words from scratch every time, the meeting would be way blown out.
Oh,
So,
it gets even worse than that. Not only do all of them have their own jargon, but they also have their own set of acronyms that
Yeah.
they use are overloaded acronyms because they mean something else in any other context. But for these particular people, this is what that acronym means, and you damn well better know it.
You are correct in that, Craig. But there's another thing where sometimes 2 different disciplines will use the same word, but they have different meanings in each discipline. So it's hard for the layperson to play.
Oh, I've been to so many meetings that the interaction gets bogged down because the 2 people talking are using the same word but are referring to totally different things.
That's an interesting thing. You can speak the same words, but are speaking 2 different languages using the same words. It's quite interesting.
And
There's words called autoantonyms, like sanction, for example, which means
Yeah.
like two different things depending on the context. So it may be like official permission, approval, or acceptance, or it
Right.
may be punishment.
Yeah.
And
Or
there are
cleave.
the cleave, or
Yeah.
table, for example, to delay something or to talk about it like right now.
Right. You know.
Now, one of the things I find interesting is when I feel like sometimes people get attached to certain words without good reason, like in cults or like certain religions, they'll like take a certain word and they'll just like, yeah, people will have this like unwarranted fascination with them, these abstract words.
Like what, for example?
I'm trying to
Oh, I have one for you. And it's something I've been reading about some lately. The word is eschatology. And what eschatology is, the study of the end of the world.
End times. Yeah.
And it's frequently used in Christian theology to talk about the book of Revelations and stuff like that. But it's become more broadly applied to the whole area of existential risk
Right.
now, where they have kind of co-opted the word eschatology. And there's a big word for you that if you said to 99% of the people, they would say, what? There you are, unless they were theologians.
Yeah, I mean, you guys were talking about the jargons, and I mean, I feel that sometimes, doctors get a little bit of unfair criticism by everybody else, because in their case, and I realized this while I was working as an interpreter, as a medical interpreter, it's really hard to interpret for doctors when they're speaking, but it's not really their fault. It's just that they're saying things that you and I probably don't know,
Right.
That's why I had to study to like not be so far behind,
Yeah.
but it's simply things that we're ignorant of, like a certain condition. They have a word for it because they know it exists, right?
Right.
You and I, we don't. So we simply do not have that word in our vocabulary. But it's not that they're making up a different word for something that they could have said in a more simple way. It's simply because they're saying something else that we don't know
Right.
about.
Right.
So in their case, I feel that it's kind of like it's almost impossible for them not to speak that. I mean, some of them are, doctors actually, some of them are pretty good at not using those words. Instead, they'll just try to explain it without actually referring to the things. But when they're actually talking about a certain condition, there's no way they have to use that word,
Yeah. I mean, in academic disciplines, sometimes they really have to, if they're talking about things that have very fine nuances from one aspect to another, they really have to use jargon, and for us the layman, it's like, why don't you just say the simple way? Because, well, you use the everyday word, there are different gradations or nuances in meaning, and they have a different term for each one.
There's an interesting but kind of related group, and that's organic and biochemists. When they come about naming new chemicals and things like that. Remember, I was talking about how do you put the picture in your head into somebody else's? The way that chemists name stuff is to convey the shapes of the molecules that they're talking about. And if two chemists talk to each other, they can actually transmit the picture by using the words because of how they name things. It's very interesting.
Yeah, we can see there a little bit of a glimpse of how language is created. There's something that you need to describe, and you create a word for it.
Right.
This may be a tributary, I don't know, but at one time I became interested in words in other languages that have no single counterpart in English.
Right.
For example, we most of us know from The Godfather, paisano, and that really, I don't think there's a single English word that means the same thing to the people whose language it is. It's kind of like you're not my cousin, but you're from my hometown. But it's more than that. It connotes a relationship that we don't have a single word for in English.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there's so many of those words from so many
Yeah.
different countries that just does not have I think a few months back, the word hygge, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, Hyggge, which is I think Norwegian notion of contentment or happiness, but there's just no direct translation in English, and you know, and there are a lot of Japanese words that also do not have any direct translation in English, and everywhere, I think, which tells you that different cultures have different experiences, that or different experiences that they pay attention to, and it's nice to encounter those words and have them explained to you, and say, oh yeah, that's interesting, that's a new take on it.
Yeah, there are certainly words like that. In Portuguese, I mean, there's a famous word, it's saudade in Portuguese, which means like missing someone, but that doesn't exist in pretty much any other language,
Yeah.
But usually languages.
And what's the word again? Say it again.
Well, I mean, it kind of that depends. In Portugal, it's saudade, but it means like you're missing someone, right? But it's in Portuguese, it's not really like a verb, it's more like it's the concept of missing someone, and that is not a normal concept to be described in one word in pretty much any language. But specific languages, sometimes they develop a word for something specific that other languages don't have. But you do kind of like, everybody understands that idea of missing someone. And
Right.
in fact, missing someone is a description of that, right? Even though it's not an absolute, like,
Doesn't capture everything.
yeah, like truth, for example, saying I miss someone is not, there's no one word that describes the concept there, like there is in Portuguese, for example. So you come up with a different way to describe the situation. So, but this kind of like begs the question almost, if some of these concepts that, for example, in English, we do have words for, like something like truth, that's a word that we have for that, or beauty, justice, good, evil. Those are clear, absolute concepts, but are they a real thing? And this, goes back to Plato, right? He's talking about, well, are these things, are we just sort of like making these things up? Are these like our words, or are there ideas that are behind that, right? Are there actual objects somewhere almost, how does he describe it?
I had
objects or absolute ideas, I think he so is there something that actually exists, or are we kind of like just trying to describe situations, basically?
Well, I had a conversation, and I don't know if this relates. I think it does. I had a conversation with the guy who invented the word meme. And we're all familiar with that word today, but it doesn't mean the same thing as he intended.
What word is that?
Meme, M-E-M-E.
Oh yeah, it was invented by what's his name?
Richard Dawkins.
Yeah, Richard Dawkins, right? Yeah.
And he said, the way he described it, what he intended was that a meme is to ideas what a gene is to a trait.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's the way the popular usage of that word is today, but he's not upset about that.
Right.
because words change and evolve.
You know, another example of that, David, I just read an article saying that woke has become a famous word in French now. Sort of like a word that people use a lot these days.
Yeah.
They just, you know, for them, it's certainly, you know, something American, but they've kind of like adopted it, you know, like woke now is a word in essentially in France, you know, and they use it all the time to kind of like describe these ideas that come from America.
Now, Vladimir,
justice
you can
and
help me. What is the common word in Russian for a machine gun?
Say it again. What's word?
What is the common word in Russian for a machine gun? Is it Browning?
Machine gun. Maybe automat, like auto. Automat.
Automatic. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's not automat. It's just automat. It's like
Automatic. My understanding is,
пулемет и автомат, I guess, two words. Like пулемет, like пуля, it's what's the English word? Like this one thing, which,
Bullet?
Bullet, yeah. It's
Bullet,
like,
yeah.
and метать is basically to throw. It's like
Mhm.
a bullet thrower, something like that.
well, my understanding, and maybe this is wrong, but my understanding is that in the Civil War or shortly after the Civil War, a machine gun was a guy was trying to sell the army on the idea of buying his machine guns, and you know he had kind of invented a new thing, and the American army was just absolutely appalled at the ferocity of this weapon. And so the guy who was trying to sell it went to Russia, and the Tsar bought him for his army.
Mhm.
And my understanding, which may be wrong, is that to this day, Browning is a word for machine gun in Russian, the same way Kleenex is a word for tissue in English. Does that make sense?
There is such a word, but I guess it's rare, so it's kind of
Falling
usually
out of fashion.
yeah. Maybe I'm just
Yeah.
you know I do like
You don't deal in guns that much.
in a certain group in military they probably use that word, but I usually hear like different words. So Browning, like in Russia, it's like Browning, just a special type of it. It's like Kalash, for example. You know, Kalashnikov.
Yeah, an AK-47.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like we may say the Kalash, basically, like another name for a gun. But it's all about neologisms, right?
Yeah.
In Russia, for example, we have lots of words borrowed from different languages, from English, from French, from Latin, which aren't Russian words, but they gradually go into language and they became just a part of language. So we use them in the same way as we use Russian language.
Well,
I guess it's with all languages. I mean, in English, there are also lots of
English
neologisms.
more than most languages. I mean, I saw the other day like the composition of the English vocabulary, which is an insanely big vocabulary. English, for some reason, has developed a very, very big vocabulary, and maybe part of the reason is that it has borrowed so many things from other languages that
We steal words.
yeah, well, yeah, and
Yeah.
and really it's really crazy because English is a West Germanic language, but the vocabulary is not really West Germanic anymore
No,
because it has borrowed so many words that it comes from at least 5 different sources. You know, like
Right.
obviously Latin languages is huge. You know, but there's
I mean, yeah, there was a big
Vikings,
shift.
you know, there's
Yeah.
so many. Oh, Greek is a big thing because a lot of complex words
Oh,
in
yeah.
English use the Greek basis. So there's at least 4, you know, Greek, Latin, the native West Germanic and also the
French
sort of
Norman.
North Germanic
Yeah.
and Normand as well, which, well, but that's kind of like it was Latin.
Yeah, Latin. Yeah.
Romance based. But yeah, so at least 4 different big sources. So it's kind of there aren't that many languages, I think, in the world that are so like mixed, that have
Right.
so many different sources.
Because there is no English Academy like the French Academy that approves words, all right?
Mhm.
And it's just really an organic growth that you know.
And it
The
has an
correct-
insane vocabulary, maybe because of that.
Yeah, the correct use of the language is whatever most people use, you know, and
Yeah, and I mean, it's languages in general. I mean, that's certainly like they're organic things almost, you know, they develop in a very organic manner.
yeah.
And that's sort of
But
the way they
but I
come to be.
I do have sort of a contrary opinion on you know, in saying that yeah, we should just let language evolve as at its own pace. But on the other hand, I think something is lost when people today cannot read works that were written 200 years ago and understand it enough to appreciate it. You know, I think something is lost there if the language evolves too fast, or you know, just an opinion. I mean, there's some cost to it.
No, there's definitely cost, but I think that's always sort of that has always been the case to some extent.
Mhm.
Because if you look at English, I mean, it has changed so dramatically that if you look at Old English, like an English speaker cannot really understand Old English.
No, because there was a big shift after
It's
the
very
Norman
different.
conquest, right? When they
But even Middle English is not so easy to understand.
yeah, you know,
So, yeah, I mean, and languages, and I mean, a lot of, you know, the Romance languages today, they're pretty much just Latin, but they're Latin that has been bastardized.
right.
But that's how they came into being in the first place.
Now, my understanding, and maybe you guys can correct me if I'm missing the boat here, is that in many languages, French, German, Portuguese, everything has gender.
For Romance languages, for sure, yeah. I think
Yeah.
that probably I don't speak Latin, but I imagine that comes from Latin. Yeah, there's no such thing really as neutral.
That's not true of English that
No,
I know
No.
of.
no, because you
Yeah.
say it, you know, and so that it is kind of like a neutral thing. But yeah, in Romance languages, as far as I'm aware, there's no such thing as neutral
Yeah.
gender.
In German, my understanding, it's really difficult because there's no system. When you learn a word, you learn the article that goes with it, because there is no rhyme or reason why one word is feminine or one word is masculine. At least that's what my son told me when he
In German as well.
in German when he studied
Yeah, I
German.
think German also doesn't have like that neutral article, but yeah, I don't speak German, so I'm not
Yeah.
sure. But Vladimir said the other day,
There is a neuter in German. So there's der, which is masculine, die,
Right.
which is feminine, and das, which is neuter.
Right, but
Now,
there's
it's
no
my-
rules.
it's
So
my
you learn the
understand-
word and the art. Sorry, go ahead, David.
No, it's my understanding that in French, a lamp is always feminine.
yeah, it is.
And I can't even conceive of that.
Well, but if you were a French speaker,
I don't
you wouldn't be
think-
able to
I
conceive
don't
of.
think of a lamp in terms of its gender.
Yeah.
I just
That's
think
just
of it
how
in
you
terms
learn
of
it.
what it does.
That's
you
just
know?
that's just how you learn it. I think
Well,
it's
the-
very different. It's very like in
the-
English, things are not female or male, but that's not really the case for Romance languages. You never like, you know, you don't understand that unless you learn an English a language like English, that has that, neutral version. I mean, you don't really understand that things can be something that is not masculine or feminine, because that's everything is masculine or feminine.
I guess what I wonder about is that does that inhibit or throttle understanding between cultures and translations and things of that nature?
Well, it makes the language more complex, since for lamb in French there are probably two words, one of like male lamb and another probably female lamb, whereas in English you just use one word to refer to both.
True. Yeah. There will always be two words for that. Yeah. And it's the same thing in Russian, you said the other day, right, Vladimir?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So it's not just, Romance languages. It's, probably many languages.
Yeah, well, my native language has no gender at all.
Wow.
No.
That's
Yeah.
kind of the opposite.
Yeah, and there is no he or she. There's only the third person singular. So I think I explained this before. When I
Wow.
moved here to the States, I was always, I don't know why I would systematically make the mistake of just using he when I should have said she, and she when I should have said he. But I think what that means is that if you grew up in the States, you are trained from the day you started learning how to talk to always keep the gender of the person you're talking about in mind, to be more gender conscious than how I grew up.
That's crazy that in the language that you grew up with, there's no gender for people. That's
No,
wow.
yeah,
That's
Yeah.
for me. For me, it's. I mean, I learned English at a very early age, but still, it's still a little bit strange for a Romance speaker that that there can be things that don't have a certain gender. But in your case, not even people.
yeah,
That's wow. That's big. It
Yeah.
makes you wonder, right? Because languages develop in very different ways. I mean, this is
right.
an example of how the way we think, we should say things. I mean, it's just kind of like a system that we developed. It's not something that is absolute. Sort of like going back to what I was saying about these concepts that might seem absolute, like truth, beauty, justice.
That brings up an interesting question. I wonder, I don't think anybody really knows, but it's interesting to debate. Did all languages stem from one common root?
Maybe I only know that
That's it.
for example, European languages are Indo-European, so that's kind of like the
No,
common.
I'm talking about in prehistory.
All the languages.
Yeah.
Nobody knows. No, there was a Russian linguist, and he was promoting, and this was something I read 30 years ago. And he was calling it Nostratics, Nostratics, and he was saying maybe we can reconstruct the proto language, the very very first language, and he and the people in that field came up with I mean, in linguistics they have some notation and for a word that doesn't exist but what they think is the root word, and so he came up with by looking at all the different languages, or most of them, and then because in linguistics you trace back, you go through the consonant and the vowel changes and things like that, and he said, what are the words that are common for a prehistoric society? And I do remember that they came up with the word tick, T-I-K, which they said is the original, the proto language for number one. And of course, who knows what it would be, but that was interesting and can never prove it. But
It's
And
all just theory, right? You can't actually prove anything like that. You can say
Yeah.
that there
Yeah.
was this word, even if we may find the earliest mentioning of language, still you can say that it was the first the first
Yeah.
word, since don't really know. Before we started recording things, just nobody knows how
Nobody knows.
long we used like just used language in a like verbal. I mean,
Right.
Yeah,
we learned to speak before we learned to write things down. And
Yeah.
writing was kind of late invention
yeah,
yeah,
in relation to speech.
we human beings may have been speaking for tens of thousands of
Yeah,
years
yeah.
before they
Hundreds
wrote
of
anything
thousands, I would.
yeah. It's so hard.
And-
It's very hard to say because it's so recent. Written language. I mean, it's a really
Right.
only recent history. Really.
5,000 years, about
Yeah. So that's only
There-
recent
there-
history.
There are lots of
3600 BC, or maybe it was when they thought the Sumerians or the Chinese started.
There are some
Dabbling.
debates in linguistics about this point, whether or not we have just one language.
Mhm.
And it's not even about proto-language, but about like the whole idea of language. Is it the same, like the same thing for all people, or it's different? And when we compare different grammars from different, like this idea of universal
Grammar.
grammar, yeah, by Noam Chomsky, like
Yeah.
that all languages are basically have the same patterns, like, you know, nouns, verbs, adjectives, and it's the same
Not
language.
gender.
Yeah, well, it's not so important here, but the idea is that we just words, they how we speak them, it's all it's random. So we don't like, we use words, they actually don't, like the word computer has nothing to do with computer. I mean, this it just you may call it whatever you like, and if we
Sure.
understand, like it's all conventional. So basically
One-
all languages are based on
One thing
Uh,
is for sure, a computer isn't what it used to be.
but again, the
Yeah.
idea is that like all, we may even say that there is no difference between English and Russian. It's just the same language, but you know, some people speak one version of it and other people speak another version of it.
There's a famous case, and this is well known among developmental psychologists and linguists, the Nicaraguan sign language, which was basically just invented by deaf Nicaraguan children who were living in this home for, you know, whatever it is, institution. And there was no formal Nicaraguan sign language, and they just invented it on their own.
Yeah, I've heard this
and,
case.
and then it was adopted as a basis for the official Nicaraguan sign language. So it's seen as proof of an innate language ability that is genetically imprinted, that's in our genes, as opposed to writing and reading, which is every person who is born has to be taught to read and write. In fact, it has to be done within a certain age to be you know, to be able to learn it easily. I mean, we can learn to read and write when we're older, but the parts of the brain that would normally be used for that have
By 4.
yeah have to start reading and writing by yeah, I don't know what age, but and so there's a difference there between language itself and reading and writing. But which is not to say, and the person I read this, but even if reading and writing is not a genetic thing, it's not something that we naturally learn, it surely has enhanced language in general. You know, languages that have readers and writers are more complex and handle more complex ideas than languages that don't.
reading and writing don't strike me as genetic things, but the ability to read and write
Oh, yeah.
might be a genetic thing.
Yeah, what I read is that in reading and writing, basically parts of the brain are recruited, and in a way that then they develop in a way that makes reading and writing basically second nature. If you're shown a word in English and somebody tells you, look at the letters, but don't read it, you can't. It's impossible.
And you know,
Right.
something that I'm interested in learning more about. I think I would ask Vladimir because he speaks Russian, but I think Russian is actually the same. Even though Vladimir, even though you use a different alphabet in Russian, it's pretty much like the Latin alphabet, right? It's the same system.
It's more like a
Greek.
Greek alphabet. It's
Yeah, but the Greek alphabet is actually where the Latin alphabet comes from. So it's certainly
they're all most of the letters are the same.
Yeah.
But for example, the Japanese and the Chinese, they have a very different system. And I speak none of those two languages,
Yeah.
so I don't really know. But I think that it's kind of a very different system, actually, the way it works, because I think it's about symbols,
Yeah.
not an alphabet like the Latin alphabet, that is basically just a translation of the spoken language. The symbols, it's almost like a different language in itself.
They're
it's in-
ideograms. And
It's interesting. For a long time, archaeologists and scientists believed that Egyptian hieroglyphics were pictographs, and they are pictures, but the pictures actually do represent sounds.
they are.
So
They're
it's
syllabaries.
It's not a picture written language, it's a phonetic language.
Oh, but what about the Chinese one? Because the Japanese, I think they use the same as the Chinese.
Well, the Chinese are basically, they're pictographic, they're ideograms, and they were adapted by the Japanese. But then the Japanese have two syllabaries to go with the ideograms. And so, because I studied Japanese for about 2 years. And so aside from the kanji, they call it kanji, which is basically the Chinese ideograms that they adopted, and they mainly mean the same things, but of course the word attached to it is different. Then they have the two syllabaries, and one syllabary is used for words, foreign words that have been adapted.
So
adopted.
syllabary is what? Is like the Latin alphabet.
Ha, ke, ki, ku, rather than letters, your syllables. A, e, I, o, u, ka, ba, be, bi, bo, bu,
So
ka, ke.
it's still about sounds.
Yeah, it's about sounds, but generally an alphabet will have about up to 30 letters, and syllabary usually is up to 40. That's mainly how they try to figure out from old script whether it's syllabary or an alphabet. But yeah, they have two syllabaries, one for Japanese words, another one for imported words.
But
And
the other kind, the Chinese kind, is about symbols, right?
yes, yeah,
So it's a completely different system.
right. There's no such thing as spelling or anything, but you do have composites of the different basic ideograms, and you get a meaning from a new word from it.
Yeah, it's interesting that there's two different perception systems involved. Like when you use a phonetic language,
Mhm.
it's basically acoustic perception, and when you use writing and reading, it's more about visual perception. And there's an interesting lecture by Marshall McCullough. I probably published it on the group, like when he talks about two different forms of languages. And before, I guess there was an idea that in ancient times, when they started using this alphabet, it changed our perception of the world to the extent which was different from what it was before. So when everybody knew Homer, not everybody, but some people knew Homer, just learned this and was able to remember it. and basically all knowledge was transmitted through one system. As when we invented this second system, writing and reading, basically changed our orientation in the world. So it became more ordered, more focused. Like the growth of social structures and societies basically was based on this shift from acoustic perception to the visual perception. But yeah, I guess it's more complex than I'm trying to explain, since I haven't figured out it to the degree when I can really explain it better.
There was a Cherokee named Sequoia that developed the written version of the Cherokee language. And one of the reasons that he did that is that when the Europeans came to North America, he realized that with written language, they were able to communicate at a distance and through time. And you couldn't do that with only a spoken language, especially at that time. And I can't remember what they are, but there are 3 major hurdles intellectually in the transition from a spoken language to a written language. And he is the only person known to have done all 3 of those hurdles. I can't remember what they are, but
What kind of alphabet did he use? Did he just use the Latin alphabet?
no, you and I would not recognize many of the letters.
Okay.
You know, they're symbols.
Yeah.
So he did use symbols.
I mean, there are alphabets or syllabaries that are actually just invented by one person. I think the Korean writing system was actually invented by one of its kings, and probably gave it, assigned a courtier to take care of it and say, oh, okay, let's see what I made. But yeah, there are alphabets that are.
Well,
an interesting struggle that Google had. Google illegally scanned a bunch of books,
right,
in other languages.
Yeah.
In Chinese. They basically steal intellectual property under the noble goal of putting all of written information, making all of that available on the internet. That in itself is debatable. One of the struggles they had is they had an automated system for doing this, and they had not taken into account that Chinese is written and read vertically.
Yeah.
and when they published snippets of books, they would take a horizontal swath, which absolutely made no sense if the language was written vertically. It would be like trying to take The Old Man and the Sea by showing you the first 3 letters of every line. It wouldn't make any sense.
Well, but speaking of Google, I mean, it's fantastic how the Google translation mechanism has improved over time, just 10 years. Now it's almost good. Like a Google translation, you can actually translate. The computer will translate from one language to another, and it will make sense. And not so long ago, it didn't really make much sense.
Yeah. But what they don't say is that they have a staff of linguists who are constantly working to fine tune the translation. They say it's machine translated, but no, they have linguists who are working on it and fixing errors and things like that. But yeah, it's still amazing. You know,
Yeah, I
don't get
mean,
me wrong.
it's amazing, and it's you know, it will get to a point that, yeah, with the internet, we'll sort of have like an international language, just by virtue of the automatic translation in terms of writing and reading. Because you know, even if something is in you know, in Russian or in Japanese, you can just click on a button, you know, and you'll read it in English.
Yeah, especially when you know two languages, it's basically you may take translation from you may use the third language, you may translate it to two languages, and you may realize the meaning. I mean, if you, it's more beneficial to know two languages. It's
Right.
you can translate virtually everything with Google Translator. Whereas when you know just one language, you may have some doubts. You may think, oh, probably like I don't understand. Like the Google Translator gives me some vague version of what has been said, and it requires more, you know, more research. But when you have two languages, like, oh, this is exactly what this text or whatever just says. I try to study like different like languages also, like Chinese and Latin, and it helps when I know Russian and English. Sometimes I just put a text and I see that there's no match between Russian and English. Yeah, this is wrong.
Yeah.
It doesn't work. But
Yeah.
when they both say the same, I understand that it's correct, and I might just use it.
Yeah, it's a good first approximation. But you know, I think in terms of when the language, and not just language, of communication in general, you know, theory of mind is critical to understanding each other more clearly. You know, theory of mind is that we are all estimating or making a guess, hopefully a very accurate guess of what the other person is thinking, what's in his or her head, context in which he or she is thinking or living or operating, and that is just something that automatic translators do not have, and I think that's why it's so hard to translate irony. You know, it's just no way.
Well, you know, along the same lines, idioms have got to
Yeah.
be very difficult.
Mhm.
I mean, if somebody just learned the English and I said it's raining cats and dogs, they would have no fucking idea what I meant.
And I think these are the things that the linguists and Google staff are fixing all the time. And they're linguists from different, of course, speak different native languages. You know, and it's, you know, language changes, so they'll always be chasing that.
Yeah, I learned actually a while ago when I was doing a course for interpreting that they think that actually that was a literal thing. You know, it's raining cats and dogs because when it used to rain a lot, like the roofs would start to collapse. You know, if
Mhm.
there were and there were back then, you know, there were lots of like stray dogs, stray cats. So like sometimes, you know, you would like a dog or a cat would fall through your roof basically because as a consequence of that. So they think that that was actually something that used to happen, and that's how they adopted that idiom in the first place, which I never
Yeah.
thought that that was the case. I thought it was just
Yeah.
like crazy English speakers or something like that, you know, like I never thought it could have been a literal thing, but that's what they think.
Right. Well, it did rain frogs once. I read in the news, right?
Did you
And
read that in the
fish.
Bible?
No, it's just actually happened, I think, a few years back. I just picked up.
How's that possible?
I think it's a cyclone or tornado that picked up frogs from a pond and dropped it
Really?
somewhere, because it happened with fish too, you know.
Wow.
You
Well,
know.
if you're like the religious type, it's raining frogs. I mean,
Yeah, yes, the end
The end-
times,
the end of the world.
eschatology. Yeah.
Um, what about, maybe we can talk a little bit about language and identity, its property as something that informs people's identity, and why that is so important to us um, as humans, like naturally for some reason. So, and that kind of like, we can tie that a little bit, I think, to the notion of like how language started in the first place and how it developed. I mean, I'm guessing it wasn't just one language, and maybe I should do a little bit more reading on this, but probably nobody truly knows because of what we said, like written language is so recent, but I can't imagine it was just one language, because Homo sapiens were probably, as we spread out, we probably developed different languages in different places because there was no contact really between people. And yes, there were some, I'm sure there were some languages well, we know this, that there were some proto languages that spread out, but there must have been more than one, and certainly each tribe, each community would have developed their own sort of like variety of language, and that I don't know if that's a natural process or not, that because of the way someone speaks, other people acknowledge that person as part of the community, and if someone speaks in a different manner, they're outside of the community. And I don't know if that's like something that we came with, that we're wired to think of that way because of the way things were before. I don't know.
Yeah, I think so. I think in-group, out-group kind of, and tribalism basically is, I think, wired in our genes, I think, and language is just another way that we try to identify which group we're in, and it's probably one of the biggest
It might be the biggest. I think it might be
identifiers.
the biggest. Yeah, and it's so natural, right? Because you hear like the
Right.
way someone sounds, and this is even before you even think about it, right? You kind of
Mhm.
like attribute, like, is he uh, uh, part of this area, this tribe, or a different tribe, right? It's almost like a natural thing just by when you listen to someone speak.
Yeah. Yeah. And I believe it could be, it's probably a life and death issue for a lot of prehistoric peoples back then, because if like, for example, in what's his name, Diamond, Jared Diamond,
Mhm.
writing about New Guinea, that
Yeah.
you could die if you walked into in the territory of a different tribe without their permission, or I mean, it's just what's done, that you walk into somebody's territory, they'd attack you,
Yeah.
and not out of malice or anything. It's just the culture, and so if you spoke the different language, the wrong language, definitely.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that might be like sort of like the way we were framed in a way, like this property of language, the that it's hard to say, right? Because it's hard to say what's natural and what's not, but perhaps that's part of it. It's an identifier. It
Right.
identifies what group you're part of.
Yeah. Oh, definitely.
And I think now it's different, because just because you go to a different country, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to kill you or bad things to you. But yeah,
Right.
from what we know about hunter-gatherer society, it doesn't seem like they were particularly peaceful, especially relating to people that were from outside the tribe.
Mhm.
But even today, we do associate the language today. I mean, it's one of the biggest indicators of sort of the nation or nationality. I mean,
Well,
it's not that
it
that has really changed in a sense. I think it's interesting to think of this idea of why language is such an important part in building a sense of a nation or a sense of a community. Why do we attribute so much importance to it?
Well, I think it's not just an important part. I think it is the basis of national identity. I mean, it's
Oh yeah, I agree.
right. It's the English speaking
so.
peoples and the Scottish Gaelic speaking peoples and the French speaking peoples, and that's what defines originally what a nation is, and a multilingual political agglomeration is I don't know. It's, well, I wouldn't say it's a new thing because the Roman Empire is multilingual, you know. But
Well, it's under, I don't know, it's hard to look at it as what is natural or not, but
yeah,
certainly we have today, even today, like in the 21st century, I think the nation states that want to be a nation state have trouble being a nation state when there are several languages in the country. Like
Yeah.
Canada is an example of that they can't quite figure out how to be a country. In fact, there's been, I think, 2 incidents of referendums for Quebec to become its own country, because Quebec is a French-speaking region, and they don't really see themselves as part of the English-speaking Canada anymore.
mhm,
But that's just one example. I mean, the same thing is happening in Belgium right now, for
Belgium.
example, as people become more defined as Dutch speakers or French speakers, which wasn't really the case. I just read about this more or less recently. In the beginning, that wasn't quite that much of a division in Belgium as it is now. But as time progressed, it kind of like became that way, Dutch speaking region and a French speaking region. Before, actually, this actually ties to another aspect, which is like we have fewer and fewer languages because these like small languages become part of a bigger language. So before there were, in Belgium, they didn't really speak French. What they spoke were similar dialects, similar languages to French. I didn't know this, but that was really what they spoke. So they didn't really see themselves as French speakers necessarily. It was just like Romance speakers or Romance. But now those dialects that were similar to French have been supplanted by French. And the same thing in northern Belgium with Dutch. But now they have this problem that they don't really see themselves as part of the same nation because they're French speakers, Dutch speakers, and it's kind of a weird situation.
My understanding is that there are between 4,000 and 5,000 languages today. And some scientists think that by the year 2100, so 80 years from now, 90% of languages will go extinct. No one will speak them.
mhm.
And I don't know if that's true, but it presents an interesting thing to consider.
Right.
No, I think it speaks to what I'm saying, right? The tendency is for smaller languages to be, it's almost like corporations today, right? You know, like the smaller corporations tend to be eaten up by the big corporations. They just get incorporated into the big corporations. And the same thing happens with language, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, it's a function of economics and just, you know, greater interchange between the different communities of the world.
And globalization.
Yeah, exactly. Globalization and
the internet.
And
And in a sense, nationalism, because it seems that nation states, because they have so much trouble with having different languages, because people then feel like they're part of different nations, the nation tends to have this need to kind of like incorporate the smaller linguistic areas in order to make things more homogeneous. I mean,
Right.
one example of that is Spain, you know, like right now with the Catalan speakers in the eastern part of the country not really feeling Spanish, right? So they want to become their own country, Catalonian. And this goes back to the time of Franco, that Franco basically made all other languages illegal because he realized in a way, also he was a fascist, but he realized that the nation state could only really exist as a monolingual state because in a lot of these cases, the nation is associated with one language. I mean, India, for example, they have like 500 different languages, and that creates problems for this idea of the nation state.
Right. Well, what India did was that because the problem was that the different language groups would say, well, why is Hindi going to be the national language? Or there are millions of us as well. And so they sort of compromised and said, yeah, the English will be an official language so that,
Well, as I
we're all-
understand it,
all
English is
even.
already the official language of airline travel.
Mhm.
All pilots, regardless
Yeah.
of the country, if they want to fly into other countries, they have to speak English.
Yes,
Speak
they
English.
do. Yeah. Yeah. So that's a compromise that India reached. So just so that people will not rise up in arms over language imperialism. And I in that thing, like about designating a national language, I think if they're just patient, if Franco was just patient, then eventually Castilian will be it is already the lingua franca of Spain, right? To operate in Spain, you have to speak Castilian, even if you're Catalan, and just don't force it.
Yeah, I mean they all
Yeah.
speak it.
Yeah,
And it's the national language. It's considered the national language, but
right.
it doesn't mean that all the other languages went away. And in fact,
Yeah.
now there's been a big backlash, like especially
Mhm.
in the Catalan region,
Yeah,
and they don't want to speak Spanish anymore.
right. Because it's being rammed down their throats.
Well, because
Yeah.
it's this really interesting idea of like a nation. So the members of the nation are the members of a specific linguistic community,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
And so if you're Spanish, that means you speak Spanish. But if you're Catalan, that means you speak Catalan, right? So you don't like ask the people that consider themselves Catalan, they don't really want to speak Spanish because they don't want to be a part of the Spanish nation anymore,
Right.
right? So it's sort of the same in Canada with the French speakers and the English speakers. And I don't know, it's an interesting conundrum, right? It's an interesting situation. Kind of like it's so weird this relation between language and nationality, because when you look at the Balkans, it's kind of the opposite. They sort of all speak the same language, but because they had the civil wars, now they're trying to pretend that they don't. I spent some time in Croatia, and people don't really like to say they speak the same language as the Serbians, even though technically they do. But now they speak Croatian instead.
Right.
And the Serbians speak Serb, and the Bosnians speak, Bosnian, even though it's, the same language, but they're trying to create different languages to go with the narrative of different nations.
Yeah, I speak the same language as somebody from Brooklyn, but I don't sound anything like somebody from Brooklyn.
But hopefully you'll understand each other.
That's true. Sometimes.
Yeah, I would bet there are actually parts of your respective worldviews that you probably have a hard time communicating with each other.
That's true. That's true. I know that there was an incident where an airplane was grossly overweight and didn't have enough fuel and crashed and killed a couple of hundred people.
Mhm.
And after listening to it, the noble goal of having one language for commercial airline travel between countries, kind of bit them in the butt because the crew member whose responsibility it was to calculate the weight and determine how much fuel they needed to make the flight, the word that was used for a female, which they had a standard weight that they used, was the same as the word for child. And so he missed every female tens of pounds. And consequently, the plane didn't have enough fuel, not because they were using the same language, but because they were. And his interpretation of the word carried over from the other language.
Can I just interrupt for just a second to say, David, I really like the Robbie the Robot model that you have over.
Oh,
your
yeah.
shoulder.
Yeah, he
That's
talks
very cool.
too. That's one of my favorite movies. And it's older than everybody else in this room except for you and me.
Well, I own a copy of it in my film library.
Oh, yeah, I do too. I do
Yeah.
too.
What is it?
Forbidden Planet.
Yeah,
Yeah.
excellent movie.
From
And do you guys remember the movie The Day the Earth Stood Still?
The original one with Michael Rennie. Yeah.
Yeah, Michael Rennie and Patricia Neal.
Yep.
And then it was remade with Keanu Reeves.
I
or
watched
whatever.
the remade version.
Yeah.
The remake. Well, the original was about aliens came to Earth and told human beings that they really needed to straighten up their act before they came out into space.
Right.
Because
Grow up or die.
yeah, grow up or die. And the Keanu Reeves version, the later one that you saw, basically said, we're going to kill everybody, all the people, because you drive SUVs. You know, we're not going to teach you. We're going to commit genocide instead. You know, and the interesting thing is that the idea for that movie, that story, came from a short story. And the short story is nothing like either movie. In fact, it's way more interesting because that similarity between the two movies. The alien comes and he's shot. And in the original short story, he dies or is seriously injured. I can't remember.
Mhm.
But so he and the robot are getting ready to leave Earth. And somebody, a scientist, a human being, tells the alien, or tells the robot, please be sure and tell your masters that we didn't intend to shoot the visitor. And the robot says, you don't understand. I am the master. That's a very different story.
Mhm.
And maybe we're not ready for it. But sorry, I digressed.
It's okay. It's interesting. So, so do you guys think like a language becomes there's as a things like literature and poetry, cinema, does that enrich the language? Does that make the language somehow superior? So there are some languages that are superior to others in different ways. They kind of like mirror the level of civilization of a certain society. What do you guys think about that?
What do you mean by superior?
Right.
Not necessarily the people, but the language. One language might be more developed, just as people develop more and more advanced technologies.
Right. So in terms of ability to express more ideas and
Well, yeah, I
Or-
mean, certainly that, but also, I'm going like even further than that, just like you basically create sort of like a cultural heritage for that language, right? With stuff like art, literature, cinema, poetry and music and all that, right? And the more you create that sort of like cultural heritage, the more sort of the language evolves and develops.
oh,
That's
so-
not something I had considered before, but
No.
like thinking about this.
It's like building a new world, like metaphysical
Yeah,
world.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, like build like something that we're building.
Yeah, and obviously that there are different worlds. So if you look at some language, like let's say English, right? So there are so many books and poetry and philosophy. And if you take some primitive language, well, primitive and not necessarily bad, but just some language which doesn't have so many books and so many ideas developed in books or in literature or in philosophy. Certainly, like one language is more superior than other in terms of it's like it's not just more complex; it's just richer. So you may
Exactly.
it's like living in a like city where there's just few buildings and living in some megapolis.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good analogy. That was sort of like what I was trying to
So I wonder about that in the 20th century, many of the very greatest mathematicians and mathematical physicists were Hungarian, and they were emigres from Hungary to the West around the time of the start of the Second World War and things like that. But Hungarian as a language is one of the most confusing languages possibly ever developed, right up there with Finnish and Welsh that the West has ever known. Yet they produce these astonishing mathematical geniuses. So I'm wondering how that relates to your question, if that relates to your question, and if so, how.
Yeah, math is a different, like it's a different language from all languages.
Hungarian, yeah.
Yeah, it's like not just Hungarian language, but math itself, it's like a form of language.
Mm-hmm.
And probably they created it because they had their, as you describe it, like confused language. So they started focusing on math and try to make it, try to create different language since there wasn't good for communication, or I don't know. But the idea is right. So if you have problems with your language, you basically want to solve these problems and creating like not creating, but just shifting your attention in a different field, like it may be a solution.
Or maybe having to master such a complex or confusing language basically sharpens your cognitive and pattern recognition skills, and maybe that translates very easily into mathematical things.
Yeah, and probably there were some people who really just was passionate about math, and like in Russia, for example, there's it actually started developing in the modern Russian since the time of Pushkin, and Pushkin was the Russian greatest poets. Like not well, he was considered as one of the greatest poets. And before Pushkin, there was no interest in poetry among Russians. There were just small circles, like maybe few hundreds people who were able to read poetry. And after Pushkin started writing his poems, he basically engaged like the whole nation into competing, trying to replicate Pushkin's poem. And like everybody was really passionate about poetry, and he basically developed this like book market. so people started reading more books. There was more journals, and if you read Russian poetry, it's like the Pushkin was like at the golden age of Russian poetry.
Mhm.
And then, well, it just well, I wouldn't say that it was just one person, but I guess personal influence is crucial here. When certain like math, for example, in Hungarian, probably there was one brilliant mathematician who influenced other people, and they start developing math and were engaged in it, and competition, all sorts of things.
Hilbert?
What?
Oh, are you referring to Hilbert? Oh, never mind.
Or, sorry, is that for me?
Oh, no, never mind.
I want to respond again to what Bruno said about do languages, become more complex or more advanced, and in terms of I think relating that to culture, I think culture is becoming whatever that more complex or more advanced, then the language has to hand in hand develop along with the culture. I think you can't separate that. If a culture, I mean culture writ large, not just arts and but culture as in everything that's man-made in that society as it becomes more complex and deals with more advanced ideas and more complicated, then the language has to keep up with it. And as I said, there's also the feedback. As the language allows you to talk about more complex ideas, then that further feeds into the development of the underlying culture. Yeah. So
And it's not even certain what actually determines what. Like the development of language determines the development of culture, or it's vice versa.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, right? What
It's a
came
chicken and egg.
exactly?
No,
chicken
they
and
go
egg.
hand in hand,
Yeah, it's a dynamical
One without
system.
the
They
other.
feed on each other
right?
constantly.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I think probably the society informs the language more than the other way around, but it's certainly, there's certainly like a loop, a
Mhm.
feedback
Right.
between both of them. What do you guys think about the idea of like an international language? Are we ever going to have some sort of international language? Should we have an international language? I think that's an interesting question. It's also a very complicated question. It's hard to come up with one answer for that question.
Well, as in
Tremendously difficult.
one language for everyone, or a lingua franca that
Well,
everyone learns.
I think probably the second one would be better, certainly.
Yeah. Because certainly Latin was or Greek before that, or Attic Greek or Koine after that was the lingua franca around the Mediterranean, and then it was supplanted by Latin. Oh well, Latin just on western side of the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
And French, I suppose. That's why lingua franca is about French, right?
And Latin. I mean, for a long time, it was pretty much an international language, at least in the Western civilization, and we kind of like went back from that, or we lost that ability to have that international language.
I mean, that was how scholars communicated across the different Western European countries through their Latin writings.
It really was, except we don't have it anymore. We don't have that international language anymore.
Well, in a way, it's English.
In a way, it's English, but it's not quite the same.
Yeah, I think eventually we'll all become so smart that we'll all be able to speak all languages, and it's just going to be like one and the same language.
Maybe you, Vladimir. I don't think I can. Unless all of them is the 5 remaining languages, I am not so sure.
Yeah, like David said, like at the end of this century, there's 90% of languages will extinct, and 10% which remain, everybody will probably knew them and be able to communicate. Well, maybe we'll just, this idea of a brain-machine interface So you don't need to learn anything. You just upload few languages and it just works.
Well, we'll end up
Like-
with the computer-made language.
Yeah,
Like feeding directly into our brain.
Well, there was an incident. I don't remember. I don't know where this happened, but I read about an incident where a company that was building robots and they had in uploaded their latest version of artificial intelligence, which is not general artificial intelligence, but it was the robots were able to in a rudimentary way interpret what they see and what they touched, and they began speaking to each other in a language that the builders didn't know. That's scary.
Actually happened on Facebook, if I remember right. They had some bots built into Facebook, and as they watched them, they found out that there was information flowing between these bots, and the programmers did not know how to interpret what was going on. And that's becoming more common all the time. It's one of the reasons that AI is something to be concerned about, not necessarily
Absolutely.
scared of, but concerned about.
Absolutely.
There was one other question that I wanted to pose to you guys before we cut off for the evening. When you talk about international language, what do you think about music as an international language?
Well, there is one theory that language came from music. I don't know if it's true or not, but that's an interesting idea. And I've played with that. And maybe it'll go back to it. I don't know.
I have a short fairy tale in Russia which relates to this in Russian language, which relates to these ideas, and I wrote it like before I shifted to English. I'll probably post it later. It's like the whole like a short fairy tale, how like well, I can't explain it. I'll just post a link, and you probably may read in translation from like Google Translator, but I guess it will translate it accurately. I'll try to translate even myself. Yeah, so like, again, it's like fairy tales. They're so different from like real communication. There's something more than you may say.
Like it has a morality to it.
No, not morale, but just its language is different from a language when we usually communicate. So I know that if now I try to interpret it, it will make very little sense.
Right.
But when it's just like one piece of information conveyed in a fairy tale, it just for me, I was writing fairy tales for almost a year, and there was one character in these fairy tales, and it was so like for me it was such a like novel and beautiful experience, and I found it's very exciting just to practice and just conveying all sorts of events into fairy tales and making some metaphors. It's kind of like new form of communication, almost like music, but at the same time it's hard to talk about it outside of this process of like making these fairy tales, their stories.
Nice fables.
Yeah. Yeah, I think music is probably very good at conveying emotion and feeling, but
it's not very good at communicating calculus.
Right.
I wouldn't necessarily say that's true, because if you start thinking about things like Fourier series and things like that, actually waves which constitute music are very deeply embedded into the mathematical notions.
Yes, but I'm not sure that we would understand that about them if we didn't know the mathematics.
So it's called, I posted the link, it's called in Russian, The Birth of Music.
Okay.
But it's more about language. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I don't really know much about music, so I don't want to speak too much about it, but yeah, it does seem that at least when it's not spoken words music. These days, like music is mostly, there's always like people saying things. So it's music plus language. But before, yeah, especially when you think about, stuff like classical music, it does seem that we have an international humanity, regardless of what
There's
language.
a lot of
We
instrumental
understand
stuff.
music in a similar way.
There's a lot of instrumental stuff in jazz, even today.
Hmm. Yeah. No, yeah. I mean, jazz, for example, I think that's one reason why jazz is so appreciated in so many places, is that that's an example of one type of music that is very nice. It's nice to listen to jazz, and it's also something that you don't really need to know the language. I mean, it's beautiful no matter what language you speak.
Yeah.
So yeah, an international aspect to music, but you guys certainly know more about that than I do, because I don't know much about music or math. I only have some basic notions about both. But I even had a friend. He studied at university with me, and he studied math and music, and he said it made perfect sense because they were very similar. So
Yeah.
we never really talked at length about that, because I don't think I would truly understand even. But he said it made perfect sense, so I believed him.
It does. My son is a math major and music minor. Oh no, a music major and
Oh,
math
your son
minor.
as well?
Yeah.
Well,
he's
there you
a
go. Two people.
music major and math minor, and a lot of people who are good in math are also have high aptitude for music. I don't know why.
Well, it's interesting. If you hear two notes that are dissonant, you know it, you feel it.
Yeah.
You have an
Yeah.
analog knowledge of that. But mathematically, you can see that they are not right for each other.
Right.
You mathematically you can see the eighth note scale.
Frequencies. Yeah.
Yeah.
Guys, in case if you're gonna read the story, which I put a link to, there's in Russian there's 3 syllables in the word music. It's like muzika, and in English there's just 2 syllables, music, and so if you don't understand it, the story may be confusing, since there's like 3 sounds and 3 animals, like cow,
Mhm.
a bee and a crow, and they produce different sounds like moo, z, and ka, like car, like crow. So it's like if you put all their sounds together, you'll have this word
Right.
musica in Russian, and sounds almost like sounds.
That word is exactly the same as it is in Portuguese, but most Romance languages.
And Spanish as well.
Yeah, Spanish, Italian.
So
I
it
think
works.
In French is musique, which is like
Yeah.
the English language, the English word, which probably came from French.
And the idea, it's like behind this fairy tale, that all are phonetics based on some sounds which other animals or different creatures like birds produce.
Right.
And when we think about it, like we humans just learn to mimic their sounds first, and then we start making sense of these like mimics, and that's how we created alphabet and like the whole way of communication. So like all language evolved from just different sounds, and we just learned our brains and our mouth were adapted to pronounce these sounds, since no other animal can mimic all these sounds. And it gets back to monkeys. So monkeys are good at mimicking what other animals do, and in the same thing in sounds. So you just hear something and you try to reproduce it, try to remake it, and then you have this whole complex system of phonemes which may help you to develop a language.
Yeah.
I read one study where a person had done an experiment with the crows that lived on campus. It was some Western university, and the researcher wore a mask and went out and tormented the birds, threw rocks at them and stuff. I don't know what all. But years later, in fact, for the birds, generations later, a person put on the mask and walked through the quad, and the birds went wild. So they had passed on that knowledge.
Right.
But the way that it passed on was through a phrase that they uttered, a warning, the barking chain,
Oh,
kind
okay.
of thing. And
Right.
the interesting thing is that, and I can't remember what it was, but it was another study that figured out that knowledge of the danger was genetic, encoded into the brain.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't read the article yet that Craig sent about the dog, but I need to read that. But this researcher's conclusion was that the way that human beings use words is completely different. If we used words, did words the same way as these birds, our head would be the size of a bus with our vocabulary.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so you get what I mean.
Yeah.
I do. It reminds me of one of the things that Tyson talked about in one of the later Cosmos episodes about bees and how bees send out scouts. And when the bee finds food, it comes back, and the famous dance that the bee does is actually giving directions to
Right.
the other bees about where to go find the food
Yep.
that he
And
found.
ants do that with chemicals.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bugs
Yeah.
are incredible.
If you ever
But-
see an ant in your kitchen, kill it.
Yeah.
It's a scout.
If you read how Edmund Wilson actually decoded the bee code, it's like, wow, how
Is that
how
E.O.
did he
Wilson?
even Edward Wilson, or is it Edwin Wilson? E.O. Wilson.
E.O. Wilson. Yeah.
Yeah, he's a famous ant guy, but also studied bees. And was he the one who decoded it, or at least his account of how it was decoded? He did decode ant communication, but I mean, it was relative to the sun. But yeah, that is amazing. How animals, apparently without any consciousness, approaching the level of humans, are able to communicate very complex pieces of information, although they're not as flexible in terms of adapting it to other uses, and but we do have, this is something that Wilson talks about too, is we have something similar in the sense that he calls it prepared learning. We have propensities, for example, to be very scared of snakes. He believes that is built into the genes, but it's not automatically activated. It has to be triggered by some event, and it can also be overcome. That not all of us develop phobias.
Along those
real
same
phobias
lines,
of snakes.
I'm still just a little bit afraid of the dark. When I go out to the car at night,
Sure.
I'm a little nervous because
Yeah.
I can't see, and I rely on my vision to understand the
Right.
dangers surrounding me. And if I
Right.
can't see those dangers, I'm worried about it.
Yeah.
And
There's
I
still.
used to feel bad about that. And then I realized I'm descended from a long line of people who are afraid of the dark
And
because
survived.
and survived because
Yeah.
many of the ones that weren't did not survive
No.
long enough to
No.
reproduce. You know,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
same
So the guy
respect.
with the bees was named Carl von Frisch, and
Yeah.
Carl von Frisch won a Nobel Prize in physiology.
Mhm.
Primarily, he's known for his work with on the study of bees.
Yeah.
But yeah, anyway, little trivia.
All right,
But
so
it is amazing how they
I'm
decode
glad
it.
that we talked a little bit at the end. I found those notions like pretty interesting because you guys are touching on some non-verbal forms of communication, which I think sort of expands our understanding of what language is. So I think
Mhm.
that it was nice to end it that way, kind of like exploring that idea that language is not just verbal. Um, so yeah, I mean, it was a good discussion. Thanks a lot, guys. Thanks
It's
for
an
watching.
Mhm.
Whoever
interesting
watching,
topic.
will watch. Do you guys have any final thoughts, or should we end it here?
One quick final thought, a question for you, Bruno. You watch a lot of science fiction films. Have you seen Arrival?
You know,
I've
that
seen
one is
that.
actually,
And if not, you should.
unfortunately, I
because-
haven't seen that one yet.
Oh boy, it has just brilliant use of linguistics
Right.
in how they communicate with the aliens, and
Right.
just brilliant.
Okay, I
And
do want to watch.
and read something about octopus intelligence.
Yes,
While you're at
yeah,
it.
what's his name? Peter Godfrey Smith
Yeah,
is the guy who
yeah.
writes about the octopus.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The alien brain or something. You know.
yeah, I forget his name of his book.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Fascinating.
yeah.
Contact is sort of like Arrival, right?
They're well, yeah. I
Same
mean, they're
theme, yeah.
good. They're both good hard science fiction, but the themes are somewhat different, and the themes of Arrival really revolve around the language
Mhm.
issue of an alien species who communicates nothing whatsoever like us.
They communicate through pattern rather than narrative.
Yep, and
Yeah.
their writing and their sounds are totally unrelated, which is one of the really fascinating things about it.
Okay, that would be a good movie to watch for sure.
You should.
about-
Yeah,
And they're really
about
big.
language.
they are.
They're what?
They're really big.
Yeah.
Big?
They're
The aliens.
nowhere near the same size as human beings.
Well,
Yeah, they're kind of like giant squids.
if we encounter aliens, they're probably going to be very different from us.
Yeah.
Mm,
Yeah.
Yeah.
What are the
And-
odds that
Who will be more scared, them of us or us of them?
Probably
Yes.
us of
Right.
them. I am
I'm gonna go with yes.
Yeah, we're chimpanzees. Yes, you know.
So
Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to just one final thought. One thing I find interesting is like couples where the husband and wife don't speak the same language. They say sometimes they have very satisfying relationships because they have to, look more at like their facial expressions or get a sense of how they're doing from watching them rather than sort of listening to the whole story that they're saying or like overthinking it. So it kind of reminded me a little bit about how Vladimir said language is what we use to, what was your phrase, Vladimir? Language is what we use to hide our thoughts.
Yes, like device intended to hide our thoughts.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's just a final thought.
yeah. I
What's
mean,
the topic?
I'm sure lots of relationships could use with a little bit of not understanding each other's language. I mean, that's can see that.
Even couples with the same language. What's the topic next week, Bruno?
Philosophy and pop culture, I believe.
Mm.
So still a little, I'll probably zero in on that a little bit, make it a little bit more specific. But basically, I think the idea is to take some, well, actually what we just did now, like some interesting ideas from movies and stuff and explore it in a more intellectual way.
Mhm. Sure.
I know Craig, for example, loves that. I love that as well. So that could be fun.
Yeah, I think Vladimir may have a harder time if we deal strictly with US based stuff. So,
Well, for the last 4 years, I watched lots of,
okay.
He watches stuff. When,
lots
when,
of stuff, related to your US culture.
when he's
Oh,
when
thin.
he's resting from his thinking, he watches TV shows and movies.
Cool.
Right, Vladimir?
All right.
Yeah.
So when I start throwing out Bruce Lee and Jackie Chan references, you'll probably be okay with those. Yes.
Bruce Lee, yeah, I know, like all movies.
Okay, good. Bruce Lee, wonderful
Drag-
philosopher too.
Dragon
Talk more
Return.
about Bruce Lee.
Be like the water.
We should get Sashir involved with that too.
Yeah. I don't know.
Okay, guys, see you next week.
Yes.
Bye bye.
Alright.
Thank you for
Good
conversation.
night, all.
Good talk.
Thank you so much, guys. It was fun.